Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be empowered in their masculinity in the anti-male age. I'm your host, Brian Crawl, and today I'm going to be mansplaining to you about the Mafia. Something that I've always been interested in, and yet it's getting talked about less and less as it's mostly went away. But back in the 1900s, when I was raised, it was something that was kind of popular in the media and is a very fascinating topic, so much so that I recently published a book about it called The Italian-American Mafia, a Socio-Political Perspective. And I would like to talk about it more on this channel, so I'm going to be starting a whole series on the topic today with this video, in which I'm going to be reading to you the first chapter of my book. Chapter 1, Introduction and Etymology. They call themselves a business, or a family of friends, but they're obviously so much more. One might call it a counterculture, a secret society, an institution, or even a cult. Whatever you would call the criminal organization named the Mafia in Italian, I can assure you one thing. No matter how you look at it or interpret it, there's a lot of socio-political information that can be gleaned from studying organized crime, criminal countercultures, and dark secret societies that have certain controlling interests in our cities and civilization in general. I have studied the Mafia and other organized crime groups and organizations off and on for over 2 decades now. Mostly the Italian-American Mafia, some of its Italian roots, as well as the cartels of Mexico and Colombia, and I even once lived in Sinaloa and met some cartel members there. I also studied some Southeast Asian gangs too, mostly the Vietnamese, which I actually did a thesis on back in school a couple decades ago when I first got into studying gang culture. In those school days when I started my studies, I was just a young punk drug dealer street kid who thought of himself as an up-and-coming gangster. I pulled my ideology for this career from Cosa Nostra, which I looked to for guidance because it was so official and successful, unlike me. That ideology helped me to be at least a little successful in my trade for a while, and I actually had some other local gangsters and thugs I knew come to me for advice because of the deep understanding of organized crime that I was developing. However, realizing I possessed more book smarts than street smarts, I decided to give up that lifestyle and pursue studies alone and writing. Now, more than 2 decades later, after more study and reflection, I've been able to derive some socio-political principles from my studies of Cosa Nostra and that Italian gang culture, with perhaps a bit of my own personal experience as a street guy thrown in there, not to mention a bit of influence from the modern mythology of mafia films that have imbued our culture and gave many of us young men much needed meaning in our lives growing up. Here in this book, I'm going to impart these findings and wisdom to you. First, let me start with a little primer on exactly what the Mafia is and is not, just to make sure everyone is up to speed on it. Coming from an academic perspective, I should start with the etymology. The term Mafia technically most directly translates to bravado in Italian, though it does have some other translations and meanings. For instance, longtime mob boss Joe Bonanno, who came over from Sicily and thus spoke Italian, translates it in his book as honor. He then translates mafioso or mafiosi as man of honor, which is ironic because I read in the reviews on his book that he wasn't an honorable person at all, but that he was the black sheep among other big mob bosses because of how corrupt and untrustworthy he was. The word mafioso or mafiosi, or in older Italian mafiosu, means man of honor or respect, or proud or fearless, or maybe something else, depending on who you ask. The Mafia refers to Italian organized crime and gang culture, mostly in America and Italy, though it could also refer to Italian gangs in other countries too. The term mobster or mob may or may not actually refer technically to mafia or mafiosi, but could also refer to mixed blood associates or affiliated Jewish or Irish gangs. Non-Italians, however, cannot technically apply the term to themselves because they cannot become official members. There are multiple different mafias. The biggest, most prominent one is called Cosa Nostra. Cosa Nostra in Italian means our thing. Now, some people have been misguided into thinking it is actually called La Cosa Nostra, and that in English means this thing of ours, when that Italian phrase is not what it is actually called, but was just an American adaptation created by the FBI so that it could be shortened to LCN. Linguistically, in Italian, the phrase La Cosa Nostra wouldn't be grammatically correct, as that translates to the our thing, which obviously doesn't make sense, does it? However, In this book, it is my goal to dispel any disinformation about the mafia that may come from the government or pop culture and give you the true academic facts about it. So let's start with the proper language. It is called Cosa Nostra, not LCN. And most mobsters in America these days who speak only English and no Italian whatsoever will often not even use those two Italian words, but will just say our thing, or this thing, or even just our friends, as this language not only comes more naturally to Americans, but it allows for plausible deniability if captured on a wiretap. Before Cosa Nostra was prominent in America, there was another Italian gang called the Black Hand. They were seen as such a scourge to society, even among Italians, that Cosa Nostra looked almost like heroes in comparison. Thus, Cosa Nostra gained massive support among the community, was a fast success, and was able to defeat the Black Hand and take over. When they took over, it was not just in the Italian community, but almost all of American gangland, and they spread throughout much of American society. There was a concurrent cooperative operation in Chicago, a syndicate called the Outfit, headed up by the notorious Al Capone at one time. This entity was not an enemy of Cosa Nostra, but a friend, basically like an associated splinter group. It was different enough that it had a different name, but for all practical intents and purposes, it was essentially the same. Thus, it can loosely be considered a part of Cosa Nostra, especially given that it has a seat on the board of directors, which I'll describe more later. Now, Cosa Nostra is not the only Italian mafia that there is. It is just the largest and the oldest that is still around today. It is also the only one that came to the US from Italy and has dominated American culture. And it didn't come from mainland Italy, but Sicily, the little island to the south of the mainland, which it dominates. Up in the mainland of Italy, there are other mafias that rule, so Cosa Nostra is confined to outside of mainland Italy. In mainland Italy, there are three main mafias. First, in Campania, there is the Camorra, especially in Naples, which has a sort of different group than the rest of the Camorra. Second, in Calabria, there exists a mafia called 'Ndrangheta, which is now the biggest and most powerful mafia in Italy. Third, in Apulia, there is a mafia called the Sacra Corona Unita, which is the smallest. Those are the four great Italian mafia organizations that exist today, though there are also many other smaller gangs, clans, syndicates, and such, which, like the Chicago outfit, you could say fall under the umbrella of the Italian mafia. Historically, there were even more types of criminal groups, such as bandits and political rebel groups. In fact, dating back hundreds of years, we can trace the mafia's origins to these kinds of bandits and rebel groups, which had formed to fight Italian enemy invaders from foreign countries like Muslims from Africa and Arabia. Italy and the smaller, more vulnerable island of Sicily have had many invasions throughout the centuries, which bolstered these rebel fighting groups who had to constantly take up arms against them, which made them also ready to resist anyone else they saw as a political enemy, such as their own government. And when it came time for that to happen, much of Italy's populist culture's support went to these rebel mafia groups, which, remember, were seen as men of honor, when often the government was seen as corrupt, especially under Mussolini's communism. And thus, this is why the mafias were able to rise to such great power over time and become such a massive political force in the country. One that could rival and challenge the government, but acted like a second-in-command or a de facto government. So when Cosa Nostra moved to America, it carried this tradition with it and became a second government in the cities it presided over. The mafia in Italy and America are very similar in how they're structured, but there are some significant practical differences. The mafia in Italy is more religious and formal in some ways, due to the fact that Catholicism is more of an official state religion in Italy. And unfortunately, Italy is also closer to being a third world country and is not as modern and developed as the USA. This means that the mafia there functions more like the cartels of Mexico and Colombia. The standards and ethics are lower. The corruption is worse. The violence is more abundant and brutal. The wars are larger scale. The killings are more frequent, and the death toll is higher. Paradoxically, in spite of being more religious, there seems to be less morals. For instance, they have no scruples about killing young children, and matter of fact, that is precisely what they do when they execute a vendetta. When there is a man they must kill, not only will they kill him, but his children too, in order to make sure they don't grow up harboring revenge and come back to haunt them later in life. There have been revenge killings from vendettas going back and forth from clan to clan, generation to generation throughout the history of Italy. In the Mafia of Italy, they have also been known to kill messengers, even their own, simply for bringing bad news. It's almost as if the Mafiosi of Sicily are more like cartoon villains than human beings. To me, this seems ridiculous, silly even, as it is something I remember seeing in the cartoons I used to watch growing up when the villain was portrayed as a stereotypical mobster. Some guy comes up to the mob boss and says something he doesn't like, so what does he do? Well, he just takes out a gun and blows him away, of course. As an adult, you wouldn't think such a thing would actually happen, but in Italy, it actually does. As you can see, the mafia in Italy seems to be a markedly less sophisticated version of what we have here. It is as if our Cosa Nostra here in the US was able to evolve a little by branching out from its third world roots in Italy. The old country mafia is very brutish, perhaps due to its more ancient medieval roots. So this is one of the main reasons I've had much more interest in the American mafia, which seems to have more honor and refinement, though of course it is still a criminal organization and thus a very dark and corrupt thing. I'm not here to romanticize and glorify it. I'm just choosing to focus more on the American mafia because it has more redeeming qualities, which makes it easier to think about, so that you are not being too shocked to your core by all of the genocidal child killing and such. Though I will touch upon some of the goings-on in Italy later in the book. Outside of the Italian and American mafias, generally other gangs of other ethnicities won't use the term mafia because it is an Italian word. There is a group called the Mexican Mafia, which is a prison-based gang organization in America that is a coalition of all major Mexican and sometimes other Hispanic gangs who have organized themselves into a unified front against other rival prison gangs such as the Bloods and Crips. There is also a phrase, Russian mafia, that you might hear in English to refer to Russian gangs, but because mafia is an Italian word, this is not a proper Russian term. Any actual Russian gangs will probably not use such a term predominantly, especially outside of English-speaking countries, and instead will have their own Russian names that they use, such as Bratva, as well as their own distinct gang culture that will be very different from the proper mafia of the Italian tradition. I make such distinctions because for our academic sociological purposes, it is important to not only use words properly, but to not confuse different ethnic groups. Unfortunately, sometimes these things can be conflated in popular cultural references, like in Hollywood action movies, where it may not seem strange for there to be gangsters who call themselves Russian mafia, Chinese mafia, or some other mafia that is fictional. Similarly, online in conspiracy theory forums, there may be talk about political mafias and banking mafias and other such terms similar to how they speak about political dynasties being crime families, like, for instance, the Biden crime family, and national banks being cartels. But this is all poetic political hyperbole that is a technically incorrect use of these terms. Let us be clear about our terminology. Technically, no one from any ethnic group besides Italians would ever be in a group called mafia. The mafia is an Italian thing, and there wouldn't be any mafia in any other cultures besides Italian and Italian-American culture. Any criminal group in another culture would have a name that is indigenous to that culture from the language native to it. And in America, any similar criminal enterprises that were not Italian would be called mobs, gangs, cartels, syndicates, etc. And also, those Italians who are in the mafia usually don't even refer to it as such because they do not want to get caught speaking about it if they are under government surveillance, which they often are. Again, let me reiterate that they will use terms like our thing, this thing, friends of ours, or our friends. For those who are not Italians but are associated with the mafia, they will usually call it the mob, and they might say mobbed up to ask if someone is an associate with mob connections. Like, do you think he's mobbed up? If members of the mafia are talking together and they need to be specific, they'd more likely use the name of the individual mafia faction that they are in. In this case, they might use a family name, like saying, I'm with the Gambinos, or the name of a subgroup within the family, like I'm with the Gotti family, or I'm with the DeMeo crew. Here in this book, I will be taking a very serious look at Cosa Nostra, especially in America. This will be done under the lens of a new social science perspective, using the influence of my sociological studies over the past 2 decades. So let us continue our analysis of this fascinating organization by delving into its actual structure. But first, in order to dive into its layers, we must discuss what exactly it means to be a member of this secret criminal society. This is a topic so cryptic that for a long time, almost no one outside of its official membership even knew for sure that it existed. In those times, any talk about organized crime was seen as a crazy conspiracy theory that made one sound incredulous. This secretive nature of Cosa Nostra is one of the things that makes membership in it so special. It even comes with a cryptic initiation ritual. Such things can make it seem cool to us outsiders, though the reality is that it is a very cold, hard, dark lifestyle, as you will come to see quite clearly throughout this book. And that is the end of the first chapter of my book, The Italian-American Mafia, Socio-Political Perspective. And I am going to be doing more readings from the book, but not very many. I'm not going to be reading even most of it. I'm only going to be reading a small fraction of it. If you want to read the whole thing, you're going to have to get your own copy at the link below, which is on sale now for a special sale price that won't last long. So be sure to check it out using that link below. It is sure to give you the intellectual stimulation that you crave. If you have any questions, you can comment below, and otherwise, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.